Hello everyone, so for my lesson plan today, we will be discussing standard 11.5.7, which is students must analyze the major political, social, economic, technological, and cultural developments of the 1920s, and students will discuss the rise of mass production techniques, the growth of cities, and the impact of new technologies and the resulting prosperity and the effect of the American landscape. So my lesson plan will be divided into 4 parts or days depending on how the school schedule is set up. The first being an overview of the 1920s and giving them some context on like what was going on in history around that time. The second part will introduce the book we will be reading, analyzing, and discussing, which is Using the Color Line and the Assembly Line by Elizabeth Esch. And the third part will consist of looking deeper into the Great Migration and the workplace by using materials and visual aids. And then the last part, the fourth part, will be the actual classroom exercise that I'll explain at the end of the video. So as we know, the 1920s were a decade of transformation in the United States, marked by rapid industrial growth, urbanization, and technological innovation. So on the first day, or the first part, we'll go through that with the classroom, an overview of the 1920s. So we'll talk about how industries were revolutionizing like the United States and made products like automobiles and that were made more affordable for the average American. So in this, we're going to be introducing like the automobile industry, more specifically Ford Motor Company. So cities grew rapidly as people came into the urban areas and certain search for jobs and new opportunities, and at the same time other technologies such as the electricity and radio were modernizing everyday life. But it wasn't just about economic growth during this time, it was also those significant social and cultural shifts which would lead into this discussion of the Great Migration. So like the migration of African Americans from the rural South to northern cities that led to cultural expressions like the Harlem Renaissance and the increased racial tensions during that time as well. So understanding these developments is crucial because they laid the foundation for the aspects of contemporary American society, from consumer culture to urbanization, and then also highlighting the ongoing struggle for racial equality. Okay, so now moving on to part 2, we'll introduce the color line and the assembly line, which is the book. So we're gonna look at Elizabeth Esch's book, and her thesis is that the Ford Motor Company, which was at the time celebrated for its progressive labor practices like fair employment and all that, it was actually used so that company actually used race as a key tool to manage its workforce and maintain control over production. So this perspective that she argues in the book challenges the more traditional narrative that Ford had as a fair employer, and instead reveals how the company exploited racial divisions to its advantage. So she supports her thesis by using a variety of primary sources, including company records, employee testimonials, and contemporary newspaper articles. And she shows how Ford's management strategies were not about efficiency, but it was about controlling that diverse workforce that they were, that was not new to them, and it just became management strategies through racial segregation and discrimination. So this approach allows students to actually like see how race and labor were closely connected in the development of American industrial capitalism. And it's important to understand these connections when studying the history of the 1920s. Okay, so for part 3, we're going to be looking into more visual aids and materials. So I'll present like a range of materials to help engage students with the content. So for example, maybe showing photos of Ford's assembly line to illustrate the scale of efficiency and mass production, and then also showing maps that shows the migration patterns of African Americans during the Great Migration to help visualize the demographic shifts of the period, and then also just sharing excerpts from the book, from the employee testimonials that Esh shows, and the contemporary newspaper articles in order to provide the more personal and contextual understanding of the racial dynamics in a workplace like Ford's. So in this lesson, as I was reading the book, it was only chapter 2 that really stood out to me, because that was, what was it called? It was Out of the Melting Pot into the Fire, African Americans and the Uneven Ford Empire at Home. So in this chapter, Ford explores the experience of African American workers. So that's where we'll find those primary and secondary sources that the students will be analyzing, which they will be used on the fourth part, the classroom exercise. So I'm going to propose a research exercise where they will gather and analyze primary source documents from the 1920s, and this can include advertisements for automobiles, the company memos for Ford, newspaper articles discussing race and labor issues during that time. So the goal of this exercise is for students to identify how race and labor were represented and managed during this period, and reflect how these issues connect to the bigger themes in American history. So they'll be working in groups of 3-4, just small groups, to complete a small presentation that they will then present to their classmates. And they'll be presenting their findings from their primary sources, and they'll also be given the chance to use secondary sources as well. And then they'll present any connections that they found in relation to the book, and then any topics that we discussed, like for example in the first part, the overview of the 1920s. They'll provide feedback to each other, whether it's asking questions or making connections to their own group's presentations. And then this is where me as a teacher will be able to assess the students whether or not they were able to understand and gain like the core concepts from the topic that we were learning about. So in this lesson, I hope students will be able to see connections from the past and present, and encourage them to think critically about the forces that have shaped our society, as the 1920s were a really big pivotal decade that shaped much of modern America. And yeah, so thank you for watching, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts on my lesson and everyone else's lesson plans. Thank you.